My name is Jasmine Segura, and I am the Policy and Communications Manager at E4FC. And for those of you who don't know me, I just started not too long ago at E4FC, a couple months ago. So I'm just extremely excited. This is my first conference, and so I've been experiencing a great energy today. So I'll just give you a little bit of a rundown of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience and why I'm deeply interested and passionate about immigration and policy in general. We'll go ahead and give you a little bit of background on California state policies. There's been a lot of victories that happened in the last couple of years, and so Gabriela Villarreal from the California Immigrant Policy Center is going to share her expertise with us, and is going to be talking a little bit about that and give you guys opportunities and ideas for how you can get involved. And then I'll pass it over to Artie Coley, who is currently a consultant, but she's also the former director of the Warren Institute here at UC Berkeley, and she's an expert on federal policy and federal immigration reform. So we have a great presenters today. And before we begin, I want to really ask all of you guys to take a moment and really think of a person or an individual, a situation that encouraged you to come to this conference. So for some of you, it might be a student, it might be yourself, it might be a neighbor, a friend of the family. So really take a moment to really keep that person in mind or that situation in mind. And I want you to think of them throughout the presentation, because I think we're going to hear about federal policy and state policy, but really just keeping in mind that policies have a direct impact in people's lives. So the time that I started getting involved, or not involved, but that I was very conscious that I needed to speak up and do something about my life was at the age of 9. So I came to this country in 1994 to be reunited with my father, who had come to the U.S. a year before. And I've always been very stubborn, according to my mom. So I kept asking her every single day to take me with my dad. And my dad had come to the United States to look for a job. And so back in our country, I was born in Mexico, and we sort of had this perception that in this country, sort of money grew on trees, and everyone had a great house and a playground and all these great ideas. So I just remember bugging my mom to bring me home and or to bring me to the United States with my dad. And so they did. My mom and I embarked on a very adventurous journey in the 90s. And yeah, so the first time I kind of had a conscious I really didn't understand what it meant, but I really just knew that something was going on was when I got detained at the border with my mother at the age of 9. And so we got detained twice, and I was able to be in a very small room packed with many other women with their children and their babies and teenagers, and all of us really not knowing who we were and where we were coming, but all of us had this sense of solidarity that we were there for a reason. And so at the age of 9, I just knew that wanting to see your dad and wanting to have your family together shouldn't be a crime. And so since then, I always knew that I was undocumented because of that experience, and so I don't have that story where I found out when I was trying to apply to college. I really always knew, and I had to grow up. I had to be there for my mom, and when we were detained, I remember having a very serious conversation with my mother about me having to grow up and having to be a strong woman for her, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't acting like a little child because I was afraid that I was going to be separated from her. So since then, I think I've always had this calling of having to speak up and really just trying to share my story. And I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to have come to Berkeley. I came to Berkeley for school and graduated in 2008 with a bachelor's degree in political economy and an emphasis in immigration policy. So with that said, I do want to encourage all of you guys to take a second and write down 2 issues that are impacting undocumented young people in your regions, so in your community, or issues that are impacting undocumented students in your particular institution. So please take a moment to just write 1 or 2 issues, and I'm gonna kind of hold you accountable to that at the end of our presentations. I hope everyone's doing it. And while you guys are doing that, I'm gonna invite Gabriela Villarreal to come up to the stage and begin the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to E4FC for holding this conference, and specifically to Jasmine for inviting me to speak to all of you today. And sorry, technical difficulties with this mic. And also just being here on a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon and spending this time with us. Before I get started, I would just love to see, by a show of hands, how many people in the audience are from California, living, working? Okay, so the majority of you. For those who are not from California, can you please raise your hands? Okay, we've got some here, 2, 3. And where are you from? What state? Okay, Mexico. And then what state here? There's somebody else. Washington. And then Washington, awesome. Oregon, and then there was somebody over here? Utah, awesome. So mostly Western states. The presentation that I have for you today is primarily looking at California state legislation, so bear with us. But I think that Washington has had, I used to live in Seattle for 9 years, a graduate of UW, go Seahawks. I hope you guys win the Super Bowl next week. Long time life of suffering for Seattle fans. But anyway, actually I was asked by E4FC to give a little bit more context about California and some of the great state legislation, but also talk about paving the way around the country for other states to also enact better policies to better integrate immigrant communities. This issue is very personal for me. Not only am I a California resident, I grew up in Los Angeles, but I'm an immigrant from the Philippines. I came over as a child with my parents, and I have undocumented family members that I worry about and stress about every single day. I have family members who've been deported back to the Philippines, and so this issue of immigration and undocumented young people in particular is very close to my heart. Now, as many of you know, you'll hear from RT a little bit later, kind of the lay of the land of what's going on nationally within Congress about prospects for immigration reform. But really, at this point, since we haven't had any changes, meaningful changes to permanent solutions to our federal immigration laws to really address the needs of the undocumented population, states like California have been taking the lead for over a decade to advance legislation to make sure that immigrant communities are fully integrated into our communities and into our society. And in the meantime, while there's a push, as you all know, for immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, there's also the calls for an end to deportations, and that calling on the president to make sure that people are no longer deported and provide administrative relief to immigrant populations here. In the meantime, there are a lot of states who are beginning to shift away from the really negative anti-immigrant sentiment that we saw a few years ago, primarily coming out of Arizona and SB 1070, that are really taking a look at how can we best address immigrant populations to make sure that there's access to education, that local law enforcement relationships with immigrant communities aren't further eroded by these damaging deportation programs. And so I'd like just to note, it's just January 25th, 2014, we're a little over 3 weeks into 2014, and so far we've seen some significant changes at the state level. A few weeks ago in New Jersey, because of the awesome organizing of immigrant youth leaders, Governor Christie signed into law the New Jersey DREAM Act. And just over the past few weeks, we have seen Maryland, we've seen Virginia actually introduce a version of the DREAM Act that's going to be under consideration in their legislation. in their legislature. And then just a few weeks ago, we also saw in Maryland the introduction of a bill called the Law Enforcement Trust Act that's going to look at the way that local law enforcement agents are able to hold individuals in local jails for immigration purposes. And that's just within the past 25 days. And so you can imagine what we hope to see from many states around the country as well. I was asked to talk a little bit about California legislation, but I wanted to give some context. So California is the home to the largest population of immigrants in the entire country. There are roughly 10 million of us who call California home. And 45% of that immigrant population here in the state are naturalized citizens. And I think this is key to remember as people are naturalizing and becoming citizens that will, and has led to some tremendous electoral organizing and political organizing where the immigrant vote, the Latino vote, the Asian vote are really, really coming to a play into not just federal elections, but state, local, school district, board elections. And so this is key. And because of the large immigrant population that we have had in the state for decades now, there has been a development of strong legislative champions in the California state legislature, as well as mayors, board of supervisors, city council members that have really championed immigrant integration issues. And finally, without strong organizing, we really wouldn't have the important legislation that we have in California. And this has been with really developed advocacy areas in particular, not just immigrant youth, immigrant communities, but the relationships that we've been able to build with faith leaders, with labor, as well as civil rights advocates. And then finally, we've seen an emergence over the past several years of really strong regional coalitions, and we're really happy to say that there's been great organizing work in inland California. Some organizations that work there are the Justice for Immigrants Coalition of Inland. Our friends at the US-Mexico border have also really developed a strong organizing node of advocates called the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium, and it's regional immigrant rights groups that have been coming together with faith and labor to really push forward some really important wins that we've had this year. In addition, I had talked a little bit about some of the data. 1 in 4 California residents are immigrants, and I would say that within this 10 million immigrant residents, roughly 2.6 million are undocumented. Immigrant workers compose 1/3 of the California's workforce, and you mostly see immigrant workers highly represented in manufacturing and agriculture, farm work. They're so critical to making sure that we have food on our plates. And then finally, I do want to recognize that the majority of immigrants from California, in California, are from Latin America or Asia. So Jasmine had asked me to talk a little bit about some of the more recent developments. And since the majority of you are from California, I'm going to assume you're very familiar already with California DREAM Act. How many of you know what AB 130 and AB 131 are and actually lobbied for it yourself and have been able to make use of that? Okay, so a significant portion of you. I won't go into it. I know that there are sessions here at the conference that are talking about the about AB 130 and AB 131 in more technical detail. But I do want to mention there are two pieces of legislation that were signed into law just last year. And again, this was through work that happened with a cross-sector of coalitions. One is access to health care. And this is so significant because California has seen recently, not as quickly as we would like, but we're definitely taking the lead at recognizing that access to health care is something that California residents should have. And the state has really been grappling along with health policy advocates and immigrant rights advocates about what can we do to make sure that populations that are undocumented, that are uninsured, can get the necessary support that they need. So last year, I do want to point out ABX 11 and SBX 11, thank you, which were enacted into law just this year. that explicitly gave individuals who have the DACA status to be eligible for state-funded health programs. And most notably, the eligibility program that is most significant for this population is Medi-Cal. So as of January 1st, the eligibility is in place for, again, only individuals with DACA. I also wanted to note that there were efforts to address individuals who have DACA or are applying for DACA to make sure that they have consumer protections. And typically you're thinking, well, they need access to employment, access to health, other ways to make sure that their well-being is fostered. And this legislation, I think, is interesting because it explicitly provided consumer protections for individuals who are applying for DACA or receiving information about DACA to make sure that anybody that they're seeking guidance from must be authorized to practice immigration law in the country. And this is key because so many people in our community have been exploited and have been shared bad information by people who are not immigration attorneys or people who are not accredited about what they can and cannot do in terms of their DACA applications. And many people have been paying upwards of thousands and thousands of dollars to people who are not immigration attorneys and who are sharing fraudulent information with them. So I think these two pieces of legislation, while they may seem like minor steps, actually do go a long way to make sure at least the individuals with DACA status here in California do have access to health care and certain consumer protections. And then I wanted to talk about three pieces of legislation that were very significant to California that took a lot of organizing from community members and workers and immigrant youth. The Driver's License Act, Trust Act, and Domestic Worker Bill of Rights were the three key pieces. But also I do want to mention that many people were very supportive of this great law that was passed and signed into law by passed by the legislature and signed into law by Governor Brown that would allow undocumented immigrants to, who are eligible to practice law here in California. So that was a significant recognition of the roles that immigrants can play in terms of contributing to our economies and our communities. So driver's license. How many of you are familiar with the California Driver's License Act, AB 60? So some of you. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about the driver's license bill. So AB 60, the most important thing for everyone to know is that it does not go into effect until January 1st of 2015. So that's next year. And this is important for our communities to know because we've already heard that there are unscrupulous people who are trying to take advantage of our community members and saying, if you pay me $500, I will help you get a driver's license. People will not be able to get the driver's license for undocumented immigrants until, again, January 1st, 2015. However, AB 60, this law, said that if the Department of Motor Vehicles is in a position to issue its regulations before that date, then they will be able to issue driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants. But again, what's in the law is January 1st, 2015. I encourage many of you to work with E4FC. They've been working with us and many other advocates around the state to ensure that these regulations are easy to follow and that they are accessible to community members. I do want to note that while having driver's license is so significant for us in California, because as we know in our state, we need to drive everywhere. We need to go to school, we need to go to work, and it's just really difficult, particularly if you don't live in the Bay Area, to get around without a license. But I do want to note that this was a very controversial bill, and unfortunately, there was a lot of division within the movement on this legislation. But I think at the end of the day that there are efforts to improve this bill. Most notably, something that's very important to know is that this driver's licenses that will be issued to undocumented drivers will be marked in a way that indicates that the person who is holding the driver's license that it's issued to is indeed an undocumented immigrant. Individuals will need to complete an affidavit attesting to the fact that they are indeed in the country without status. And there are certain risks to that many of us, and again, please join with E4FC, are doing to do our best to improve the law, to make sure that there's some privacy and civil rights protections related to that. But it's important for community members to know that they will need to sign a piece of paper basically stating the fact that they are undocumented. And if you take out your driver's license now, for those of you who have that license, if you take a look at under California, it says DL, and it has your driver's license number. And the way the front of the driver's license is going to be marked, it will say DP, as in driving privilege. The font will be the same, the color of the text will be the same, it'll be the same size. However, this is really of concern for many of us, because what if you have that bad actor, unscrupulous, local law enforcement agency who sees his driver's license and profiles and arrests this person, or even worse, calls immigration and holds a person and calls immigration. So there are very important considerations that people need to take if they choose to apply for the driver's license. Conversely, it can also, having this driver's license can also prevent someone from having their car impounded and taken away. And that's a real reality for many people. Also, you can be, if you're stopped by law enforcement, you can be arrested for not having a driver's license or any type of identity document. So it still puts you at risk if you don't have a driver's license at all and you're operating a car. So those are just some of the things to be aware of. Next, I want to talk about the Trust Act, and this is AB4. This legislation actually started as a bill in 2011 and worked its way through the legislature and went through many amendments. But basically, this bill was taking a look at how immigrants are held in local jails for immigration purposes and recognizing the fact that immigrant communities in California have really suffered an erosion of mistrust with local law enforcement entities. So AB4, the Trust Act, will limit how local law enforcement will hold immigrants for immigration purposes in local jails. And then finally, I do want to recognize the fantastic work for nearly a decade that immigrant women, domestic workers, had led to get the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And specifically, this creates an opportunity for individual caregivers within a private residence, an opportunity to get overtime pay. Something that many of us can take for granted, but is something that actually domestic workers have been excluded from in the past. So this is certainly one way to improve the economic contributions that domestic workers, primarily immigrant women in the state, can have. And also, I wanted to also say this is a great work that we have at the state, and it really is dependent on us as immigrant advocates to do the education and share and make sure that these laws are implemented correctly, fairly, and justly. But there's so much more we can do at the local level. So I wanted to take just a few moments of time that I have left to outline some really better policies that have taken place here in California at primarily the city level. So the city of Bell Gardens is in Southern California, right outside of LA, as well as the city of Watsonville, which is in the north central coast here in California. These two cities, several years ago, passed ordinances to make sure that city government agencies do not ask about a person's immigration status. And it specifically prohibits them from asking about immigration status, except for areas in which they need to do so for federal purposes. So that goes a long way. You just want to make sure that libraries, when someone's trying to get a library card, that they aren't asked about their immigration status. It's entirely irrelevant. So if you don't have a similar policy like this in the city that you live in, this is something to take into consideration. City of Monterey Park, again, outside of Los Angeles, with a very large Asian immigrant population, several years ago also passed a local ordinance to make sure all of their city public agencies provide translated materials to all persons with limited English proficiency. Again, something that can be done in your city if you already don't have a policy or ordinance like this in place. I also wanted to mention, I talked about the Trust Act and how it creates a standard for local law enforcement on when to release individuals who are being held just for immigration purposes. I do want to recognize the fantastic work and organizing that happened in Santa Clara County over the past few years that explicitly separated local law enforcement from federal immigration enforcement by having a no detainer policy. But Jasmine, who's with E4FC, was a longtime advocate for that and can speak to that if you have any questions. And finally, I know that there are educators in the office. Education policy is not my expertise, but I do want to share this resource with you that the National School Boards Association put together. They have a number of model policies for how school districts and public schools can address and create policies for undocumented children. So, and how can other states lead? I thought there'd be a little bit more people from other states. Again, youth leadership and organizing is going to be key to any of the work and wins that we have. I'm just a policy advocate. I read pages of legislation, and none of these bills would have happened if it wasn't for the deep organizing that happened, not just with immigrant youth and our partners, but also our friends in the faith, from congregations, labor leaders, civil rights groups, who all came out to support all of the bills and brought us to the point that we are today. Also, voting. Again, I had mentioned 45% of the immigrant population in California is composed of citizens, and continuing to flex the immigrant vote is going to be key to make sure that there are policies that continue to promote family unity instead of separating our families. And then there are other two pieces that I didn't list here, but I do want to recognize is the role of art and artists, and a way to communicate visually through stories, and put a human face into all the work that we do, and also to put a human face on the devastation that these devastating federal immigration programs are having on our families. So I strongly encourage all the artists here, or those of you who are advocates who are working in education policy or immigrant rights policy, really building those partnerships with artists, because they are able to get to the hearts and minds in a way that me as a policy person can't really get to. And finally, another partner that I would all encourage you to help to advance better policies in your city or county is to really make use of ethnic media. They have really been able to educate our community in a way that we, as organizers, may not be able to. We have seen tremendous amount of education that's done through radio, particularly for our allies and community members who live in farms and are in rural areas and may not be literate in their own primary language. We've also seen the wonderful impact TV has had for not just sharing our stories and educating people, but also putting elected officials, the governor and state legislature, hold them accountable to immigrant communities and their needs and our rights. So definitely take into consideration ethnic media as one of your partners to advance better legislation. I wanted to share some resources. We have some handouts that will be shared with you later this afternoon. Our website, caimmigrant.org, we have a toolkit that we developed for the California driver's license, AB 60. It has a lot of educational materials. It's also translated into Spanish, and it's a great resource, so please take a look at that. Also, for those of you who are interested in learning more about the state-level health programs that are available for individuals with DACA, we created a report that outlines the various options for health care that residents in California who have DACA may be eligible for, and that's our Your Health, Your Future document, again, on our website. If you want to learn more about the California Trust Act, there are a lot of resources there. And then finally, I also wanted to make sure people had an opportunity, if you wanted to learn more about the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, that is their website. And then finally, if you have any questions or comments, I apologize, I need to go to the airport and leave a little bit early. If I'm not able to answer any of your questions now, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Thank you.
Does anyone have any burning questions for Gabriela? Otherwise, we can, and then, or RT and I can try to answer them later, but any urgent questions? No, you're good. She needs to go catch her flight. And your computer. This is yours. Okay. So while we settle here, I do want to introduce RT Coley, who's currently leading a project on immigration reform and the immigrant vote at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Like I mentioned, she's an expert on federal immigration laws and policies. She's done a tremendous amount of work around immigration reform, so I want to welcome RT to the stage. So thank you.
Thanks for get this out. Thanks so much for being here, and really, it's almost impossible to follow Cesar, and I can't say that Congress is as entertaining as him, but they have their moments. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sit, and I hope that we can make this slightly more interactive. I do have some remarks to make, but I'm also looking forward to having a discussion with you all. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin. So where are we at the federal level? I think many of you have been probably following the antics of Congress in terms of trying to pass some sort of immigration reform. Last year, we had major movement in that we saw a comprehensive immigration bill that was passed out of committee in the Senate and that was passed off the Senate floor with significant bipartisan support, at least more bipartisan than we've seen them act in recent years. And what's notable, there's a few notable things. One thing is that the DREAM Act has been proposed over the years since the early 2000s. And unfortunately, it came close a few times, but it never passed both chambers, both the House and the Senate. And I think there have been a lot of politics around, whether, and conversations, should the DREAM Act be a part of broader immigration reform or not? And last year, I think there was a consensus amongst most of the advocates, the Dreamers and the more traditional immigrant advocates, and even the new people at the table, which are people like the high-tech community, the ag community, to say, okay, we're going to do this, we all agree, we're in it together. And so DREAM is going to be folded into a bigger immigration bill. And actually what you saw in the Senate bill, which has, it's a 1,000-page bill, I've read it, and it has a lot of stuff in there. And it's, the DREAM provisions were incredibly generous relative to the independent DREAM bills. So, for example, there's no upper age limit, which is a huge thing. And for example, Jose Antonio Vargas would have been able to be a part of the DREAM provision. The pathway to citizenship was 5 years, whereas for other non-DREAMers, it's 13 years in that bill. If you were a deported DREAMer, you could apply. These are provisions that I think a lot of people weren't really, I'm sure some of you are aware of them, but the general public is not aware of them, but very crucial to many people in the DREAM community. And you wouldn't have to pay fines. You'd still have to pay the fees, but other mostly everybody else would have to also pay about $2,000 or more in fines, and the Dreamers wouldn't have had to do that. And it would also get rid of the provision that we have now, which requires states like California to pass, for example, the state bill, the DREAM Act, the provision that basically prevents states from offering in-state tuition just on its own without a law. It would get rid of that provision. So these were things that when you think about what's going to happen in the House, it's most people are pretty pessimistic that the good pieces of the DREAM bill that were in the Senate are going to make it into whatever is proposed, most likely whatever is proposed by the House Republicans. So what happened last year is at the end of June, the bill passed the Senate, and then it was time for the House to act. And guess what? They didn't. They just sat on their hands. And meanwhile, there were demonstrations, all kinds of things happening in DC and across the country, sit-ins, but the House still felt like, it was clear to people who were watching it, what was happening is that there was no consensus amongst the leadership in the House, which is the House Republicans are in charge, as to what to do. And there were deep divisions because there is still a segment of the party that believes that the only thing to do is enforcement and more enforcement and to kick everyone out. And that is the only solution. While there are other people, and the House, when you're a senator, you think about getting elected in a whole state. You don't think about getting elected in a region or a district. And perhaps you have presidential aspirations. And so you look at your electorate in your state. Oh, wait a minute. I have Latinos and Asians and more people of color who are voting in my state? Oh, okay. Oh, if I want to become president, I can't become president without the Latino vote or without the Asian vote? Oh, that matters. But if you're in a district deep in Georgia where all the people who you respond to are not people who care about this issue, and in fact, they want you to do more enforcement, what are you going to support? And those are many of the people that we are dealing with in the House. But they are also, their districts are also changing. So, you will hear sometimes people say demographics is destiny, and I feel like with the immigration issue, that's very true. We will be having different conversations 10 years from now, 20 years from now on the policies. And California is a great example of this. I mean, the bills that were passed last year that we're looking at hopefully passing next year, would that have happened 20 years ago? Most likely not. And why is it? It's because of a changing electorate. And so in the House, what you have now is enough pressure has built up where they feel that they can't not do anything. They have to do something. What that something is remains to be seen. So what they've promised so far is that Speaker Boehner and other House leaders are working on a set of Republican principles for immigration reform. Most likely, the people who've seen them have said they're going to be broad and vague. But Republicans have made it abundantly clear, they've made a few things clear. One, they're not going to take the Senate bill wholesale. So one way this could have worked is the Senate passed their big bill, the House could vote on that bill, and then it becomes law. That's not going to happen. We know for sure. Another way this could happen is the House passes their own big bill, and in fact, Nancy Pelosi and a few Republicans introduced almost the same bill in the House. It's called H.R. 15. It's most likely not going anywhere because it doesn't have the leadership support. And that could happen where you have other discrete bills. For example, if the House passed a high-tech worker visa bill and a couple of an ag bill, all of those are put into a package and they're conferenced with the Senate bill. So right now, the Republicans seem to be suggesting that they're not interested in conferencing anything with the Senate bill. It's going to be their way or the highway. And we don't know for sure how this will, I mean, and all of this is a lot of, you have to understand there's posturing, there's everyday things change. Decisions get, altered. People come up with ideas for, changing legislation as well. So we know that we're going to get principles. And then there is also, for months now, this talk of a KIDS Act. We haven't seen the language. It's likely to be some sort of dream bill light, a version that doesn't have the provisions that I was just mentioning, in the generous stuff that's in the Senate bill. The House has passed a bunch of immigration bills that will most likely be folded in. And you're probably wondering, like, really, why? Why do I care whether the ag workers or the high-tech visas or the, enforcement bill is in there? Well, the reason that those bills are important is that the pressure that you see building in Congress, it comes from all different sectors. So you have the farmers, you have the Zuckerbergs, and you have, and without the pressure of the different forces that are invested in that legislation, we're not, most people are afraid that we're not going to get anything out of the House. And so the other question that we're going to be dealing with this year with the House legislation is that the path to citizenship. And how is it going to be structured? Are they going to try and create a permanent underclass where, okay, perhaps the dreamers would get access to citizenship, but their parents and the older undocumented folks would not? And so that is definitely, I'm probably repeating some of the remarks I'm going to make later on today on the panel, and I apologize for that. But I just think this is just such a big issue that folks are going to have to contend with and should start thinking about. It is a strategy of dividing and conquering. And it's ironic because the idea is, well, the reason that it's okay to not have a path to citizenship is because there's so much enforcement. But they're not going to be just happy with not having a path to citizenship in the immigration bill that the House, Republicans produce. They are going to have probably 5 times as much enforcement as we have now. They are bent on the Arizonification of the entire United States. And it's called the SAFE Act. It's been introduced. It's been passed by the Judiciary Committee. I was there. I saw it being passed. And there are a lot of provisions in that bill that people are completely unaware of. So in the SAFE Act, right now, if you're overstaying a visa and you eventually get married, you still can legalize. You don't have to leave the country. What it would say is if you're overstaying a visa, you're now a criminal. Right now, if the act of crossing the border is a crime, but being here unlawfully is not a crime. Being here unlawfully would be a continuing crime once you've crossed the border. That's just one of like 20 other provisions. Just off the top of my head, some of the provisions. If you're driving somebody who's undocumented to a job, you're harboring them. Knowing knowing that they're undocumented. This is for the future, and so these and things like the 287G program, which encourages local law enforcement to investigate immigration crimes and violations, that would be renewed and expanded, despite the fact that the Obama administration has been tamping that down. So all of these different, I mean, it may not end up, I mean, the SAFE Act has passed committee, and a couple of different things could happen. It could be folded into a package, or they might just say, okay, we'll take a few of the, bad provisions out of the SAFE Act and fold it into our bill. So those are all things to be really aware of. And, one thing in terms of the conversation that, really I think came together last year was that Dreamers came out and said, for us, it is really important to get resolution not only for ourselves personally, but for our family members. Because we're part of a community. We're not just independent people alone. We have parents, siblings, aunts and uncles. And I think that one of the things to be aware of is that it is, the ability to, have your status issues go away. I mean, that's an amazing offer to have that option. But then what's going to be left for the people who are going to come after you? And what's going to be, left in terms of for folks who will never be able to become citizens? And so those are tough conversations, and I think that it's important for immigrant advocates, for people who support Dreamers, and for Dreamers themselves to really think about those things thoroughly and to really be aware of the details. I worked, sorry, I didn't really introduce myself. I'll do it now. Arthi Kohli, and I started my career in Congress. I was, in DC. I worked for a member of Congress, Howard Berman, who was one of the people who introduced the DREAM Act, and I'm a lawyer by training. I started my career doing lobbying for Unite, the garment workers union. Their members were low-income immigrant women, some of, perhaps your parents. And so, I came to California and became the director of immigration policy at the Warren Institute, where a lot of my work has been on enforcement and the impact of, of programs such as secure communities, which I don't know if we had a chance to mention that, but this is an example of, where we are right now in terms of enforcement, which is that right now we're deporting about 400,000 people a year, like an average of 1,000 people a day. And Secure Communities is a program where if you get arrested and get taken to a jail and your fingerprints are taken, those fingerprints are checked against an immigration database. And you can be immediately identified as undocumented, and immigration authorities come get you from the local jail. So communities are feeling like it's the local police who are deporting us. And the local police don't even have the option of whether they're sending those fingerprints or not. They're automatically sent to immigration authorities. Where the local police have the choice is when immigration comes to the local police and says, hold this person until we come get them. And that's where the Trust Act has come in. And basically, in California, we've made a decision that we're only going to hold violent, serious offenders for immigration authorities. And so we're in a regime, we're in an environment where enforcement is so heavy, and the idea of making it worse is pretty shocking. I lost sorry, I have a minute left. So I will just, so my work at the Warren Institute was related to Secure Communities and the impact of that program. And last year I worked intensively with the National Immigration Law Center and on immigration reform. And I would recommend to you, if you want to know details about legislation, on their website, nilc.org, nilc.org, are great fact sheets and summaries of the various provisions, the DREAM bill, the DREAM provisions, and S70, the Senate bill, and whatever pending, whatever gets introduced in the House, I'm sure they'll have a summary of that as well. So, yeah, can we do questions? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'll recommend a few different things. So I don't know if everybody heard, but she said that she's from Santa Maria, and ICE is trying to build a detention facility in their community, and the city council is not being helpful, and she wanted recommendations on how to protest or stop it from being built. And you know, this points to another issue in this whole bill. It's the money, right? So the reason the city council is probably not being helpful is there's money coming from the federal government for that facility, and there will be most likely some jobs as well. But, you know, a lot of times it's private contractors who are making the profit. And it is important to understand whether the money is going to come to the city or the profit is going to come to a private entity, because you might be able to convince the city that, you know, it actually isn't as beneficial as they think. So I would do find someone who can, you know, do some digging in that respect. But also there is, so Gabriella with the California Immigrant Policy Center I would definitely suggest that you connect with them and with the ILRC, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco, who they've been working a lot on state enforcement, and detention. I think with any advocacy campaign, you have to have a sort of a very well-rounded approach. So you have to have pressure from grassroots, you know, if you want to do civic actions, get media involved. Media is very important. Yeah, so as much pressure as you can put on the decision makers, you know, as possible. I think that's important. So back there, and then you're next. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So in the immigration bill, they would be, under the Senate bill, they would be eligible for financial aid. They would. But I doubt that the House Republicans are going to put it in their bill. That said, there's been an independent bill that was introduced by, not Furman, no. I don't, just recently, yeah, that would allow students access, that would create a separate pot of money for access to aid. But, you know, the likelihood of that separate bill passing, I don't know. With the House, you need Republican support to pass your bill, right? And just traditionally, they've been reluctant to, they're very willing to spend money, throw money at enforcement, but to support the education of, you know, undocumented kids or just most kids, they haven't really been willing to do that. So, yeah, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I think it's just something that we're going to have to watch, but I agree with you that is something that should be highlighted because it's not just the ability to apply for college, but you have to be able to pay for it. Oh, yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to address, sorry, that was loud. The other question, just very briefly too, that in terms of immigration reform, I think it, like RT said, it's going to be very difficult to sort of try to tie in the education and financial aid. That's been sort of a very an issue that's been going on for many, many years for undocumented students or just undocumented immigrants in general. There's been a lot of pressure to not make them eligible for any kind of financial aid or any kind of public benefit, including in-state tuition, including state-based financial aid. So I think, like RT mentioned last week, there was the In-State Tuition Act of 2014 that was introduced that really tries to address that issue by setting up a pot of money, $750 million, to encourage states to pass in-state tuition laws. And so it is trying to encourage, but again, we don't know what the possibility or the viability is for this bill, since a lot of the immigrant rights groups are really focusing on immigration reform. So I think that right now we're seeing now a growing number of states that are offering in-state tuition or offering state-based financial aid, and I think that you can continue to make the argument that integrating undocumented youth into society, and it's only a matter of time before they're eligible to work and have, path to citizenship, so it's worth investing in them right now to be preparing that workforce for when immigration reform happens. So that continues to be the main argument that we are using on that issue.
Okay, so as to timing, apparently the principles have basically been drafted, as far as I know. They haven't been, supposedly will be released in the next week or two. But then the Republicans have said often, we're about to do X, and then, X takes a month or two. That said, there's different theories. There was a theory that the Republicans would act after the primaries because, for a lot of Republicans, their primaries are from the right, so they're being challenged by a Tea Partier or somebody who's even more conservative than they are, and so they can't really vote for immigration reform because, that would be one more, piece that the Tea Partier could attack them with. So after the primaries, supposedly, is the window where you could get House action on immigration, and that would be later because a lot of the primaries aren't until summer. So that's the general perception of timing. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about private scholarships for undocumented students? You may know that many private scholarship providers are willing to offer scholarships to undocumented students. Some do not.
Right.
Because they claim that one legal interpretation might be that it's harboring undocumented people and therefore
Yeah.
a federal law violation.
Yeah.
If we ever pass the SAFE Act, they might have a case. But under current law, what's your interpretation of that?
Well, so if you look at, and I did when I was at the Warren Institute, look at what are the harboring prosecutions that have happened. They're very few, and they're in very blatant extreme cases, and no one's ever been prosecuted for helping an undocumented student. And I would be, U.S. attorneys are public figures. So if federal prosecutions are brought by U.S. attorneys. And if you're a U.S. attorney who's dumb enough to go after somebody who's supporting an undocumented student, then you're going to be out of your position, whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. I can't imagine that would happen. So, yes, one could make an argument. You are at risk for prosecution, but reality, I doubt it. Any other questions? Okay. You have something?
So I think, thank you so much, RT, for that. I think she's going to be joining us later, too, for a panel discussion to discuss the current state of immigration reform. So she's going to go a little bit more into details with Jose Antonio Vargas and Ju Hung, who will be joining us today for the panel discussion. But I did wanted to take a moment to give you guys a sense of different opportunities that you can get involved this upcoming year. So the presentation was really trying to encourage you guys to get active at the local level. So there's a couple things coming up at the state level. There's a state bill that was introduced by Senator Lara, who is a healthcare for all legislation. So if you're interested in healthcare, as we all know, undocumented immigrants got excluded from healthcare reform, and they're sort of being pushed into community clinics, which that's great, but the resources are very limited. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, make sure that you contact Gabriela from CIPC. They're one of the leading organizations that's working on this bill for healthcare inclusion. There's a couple other things coming up. I'm sure I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Sergio Garcia AB 1024 bill, but it's a bill that was signed last legislative session and really allows undocumented people who want to be aspiring attorneys to be able to practice law if they meet all eligibility requirements in the state of California. So Sergio Garcia was sort of the face of this bill. He completed law school and went off to take the bar exam. He passed it, and he was really making the case for him to be admitted into the bar exam and be allowed to practice. And so that was a great victory. The legislative session did sign the bill, and then later, a couple weeks later, the California Supreme Court also ruled in his favor and admitted him into the California Bar Association. So I think with that said, there's a tremendous amount of effort and support and encouragement from different legislatures here in California to try to expand that access to career licenses to other professions. So E4FC is working very closely with ACLU and MELDEF and other organizations to try to do research around this. So if you are a student or a young professional, undocumented, or with DACA, or know of anyone and they're in the process of or doing research about their career licenses, please feel free to contact me. We're looking for personal stories right now to be able to make the case for, or the need for this bill. So we're really excited about that, and California is moving forward, continues to move forward, and really just be a good, sort of like an example and role model. No offense to the other states, but I think that it's really been due to the tremendous amount of effort and pressure and organizing from our local communities. That in the last couple of years, we've seen undocumented. The faces of undocumented people who are affected themselves by all these policies being at the forefront of these legislative victories. So I really encourage all of you guys to be, committed. You guys are all committed allies. And I want to take you back to those two issues that I made you write at the beginning of the session. And if you can really, out of those two issues, if you can write down one or two things that you can personally do to address this issue, whether it's having a conversation with an ally, whether it's having a conversation with other educators and teachers, whether it's encouraging your student to share their story, answering, being a spokesperson for a media interview, or bringing the issue to your school board for a resolution. If you can really take the moment to write down what you think you can do, and like we said, all these legislative victories came about because of the organizing of people on the ground. All of you guys are experts and know the issues that are happening in your community, so I really encourage you to do that. And then lastly, just being aware of the DACA renewal process. That's also another campaign that's going on. We're trying to find out more information about the requirements, the process, the timeline for that. In your packets, you will find more information about what we know so far based on informal conversations that we've had, not us personally, but that different organizations have had with USCIS in Washington, D.C. to try to figure out what that process is going to look like, since a lot of our community members are going to have to, get on that process pretty quickly. So we're hoping people are going to start probably applying sometime in March or April. There's still no official process for that, but if you have any questions around that, feel free to check out our resources on your folder. So.